Quintus Cornificius, Praetor 45 BCE. Cornificius, a well-known poet, was a prominent figure in the literary scene of the late Republic. He spent many nights out with the famous Catullus as a young man, and later he corresponded with Cicero. Indeed, he was never without an intellectual companion, as his own sister Cornificia was a well-known poetess in her own right. Politically, despite his friendship with Cicero, Cornificius ended up siding with Caesar when the Civil War broke out. Along with his fellow Caesarians, Aulus Gabinius and Publius Vatinius, Cornificius was able to fend off a strong Pompeian challenge in Illyricum in the aftermath of the Battle of Pharsalus. As if governing one notoriously rugged area weren't enough, Cornificius was next tasked with governing Cilicia. Then he was forced to intervene when Syria was threatened, and he led his men from Cilicia to deal with that threat. After Caesar's assassination, Cornificius, who was friendly with the assassins, became the governor of what was then being called Africa Vetus. Not long thereafter, Mark Antony tried to have Cornificius replaced, but he himself was outlawed and his legislation was annulled. This turn of the worm, however, would prove to be temporary, as Antony would make a stunning comeback as one-third of the Second Triumvirate mere months later. Antony was clearly no fan of Cornificius as he put the governor's name on the proscription list. Cornificius defended his province unsuccessfully, losing his last battle and his life at Utica. Although his political career soon faded into obscurity, the poetry of Quintus Cornificius and his sister remained in circulation until at least the early 5th century CE. We don't know where the Cornificii may have hailed from, but it is fairly likely that Quintus Cornificius was the first in his family to enter the Senate. He came along at a pretty propitious time for new men, as the Roman Republic was in a bit of turmoil, and a fairly large number of new men were able to make it to the highest offices in the land. One of Cornificius's later friends, Cicero, in fact, was also a new man, and part of the way that Cornificius made his way in the world was by being an intellectual. There was a fairly large contingent of the Senate who were men of letters, and so having that kind of learned disposition could make you friends in high places. Men such as Caesar and Cicero were fairly well read, and they definitely appreciated that quality in men of the younger generation who they tended to take under their wing. It's very apparent, too, that Cornificius's parents were interested in making sure that their children were well educated, because Cornificius's sister, Cornificia, was also very well educated and went on to be an accomplished poet in her own right, possibly even being a more renowned poet than Quintus was. Both of them together, though, were well regarded in their time and continued to be read for many years later. As for Cornificia, she actually went on to marry a wealthy equestrian man named Camillus. In all likelihood, the marriage between Cornificia and Camillus was a kind of political and economic exchange, insofar as Quintus Cornificius was a rising star in Roman politics, and Camillus was a money man. And so the idea here is that as Cornificius rises in eminence, Cornificia's family, her new family she married into, will also rise in eminence and have a bunch of economic opportunities. And then, of course, Camillus will then funnel some of that money back into Cornificius's political endeavors. So this was not an uncommon arrangement for different Roman senators to make for one of their family members to marry off into a wealthy equestrian family that might not really have that many political ambitions. So that was a relatively common thing. As for Cornificius's wife, we don't know who he married, and he doesn't appear to have had any children that we're aware of, although there is at least one scholarly article by Elizabeth Rawson from the 1970s where she argues that there were two men named Quintus Cornificius and that one of them was a generation later. But as things stand now, most people believe there was only ever one Quintus Cornificius. You might be wondering about the Jim Cornette picture, so I'll go ahead and explain that really fast. So when I was putting this presentation together, one idea I had as a kind of joke was to refer to Cornificius as Corny the whole time, and to use images of Cornette to represent that, but instead I decided to just explain the joke here and then not revisit it. It's a relatively common claim by people who write about and study the late Republic that the last generation of the Republic was somewhat degenerate. That being said, I believe that it's largely an unfair critique, and that most of the fatal mistakes were made a generation or two before that last generation had a chance to reach adulthood. In fact, that last generation of the Republic, who were in many ways inspired by the chaos around them, went on to be brilliantly creative and really helped to form Rome's culture going forward. Many of those men were also friends with Cornificius. If we look at his literary circle, it's a who's who of who you would need to know in the Roman world in order to be truly cultured. Gaius Valerius Catullus is one of Cornificius's best friends, and he's also probably about the fourth best-known poet in the history of Roman literature. Catullus mostly used love poetry as his medium, and he chronicled a love affair with the notorious Clodia from the time that they met until they finally broke up a few years later. And he goes through all of the emotional turmoil that he as a young man in his early 20s went through while falling deeply in love with this older woman and ultimately not being able to attain her because, well, she was already married to begin with, and also his social rank was not high enough for any kind of permanent, lasting relationship to form. Catullus also would address one of his poems directly to his good friend Cornificius, and he would call upon Cornificius to give him solace as he had gone through a number of trials and tribulations, most likely related to his emotional turmoil dealing with Clodia. And of course, in his poems, he called Clodia lesbia because he couldn't be open about the fact that he was having an affair with a very well-known married woman. Another member of the circle, perhaps the most accomplished of them all, was Gaius Asinius Pollio. Pollio is someone who went on to be consul, so he played the triumviral politics better than the rest. He was able to remain on good terms with both Octavian and Antony, something that, as we'll see, Cornificius never figured out. He went on to be consul in 40, and then he largely retired from politics, and for the next 44 years of his life, he dedicated himself to being a devoted patron of the arts. So what he lacked in personal creativity, he more than compensated for with his generosity and his public-spirited spending. He created Rome's first public library and a public gallery, where he displayed a lot of the best-known Hellenistic art of the time. Asinius Pollio also was a generous patron of the arts and sponsored many budding poets, including Virgil, the author of the Aeneid. And it was none other than Asinius Pollio who introduced young Virgil to the Emperor Augustus. And so this is why Augustus took such a keen interest in the Aeneid, and later sort of declared it to be Rome's official origin story. There were some other members of this charmed circle who were just as talented, but perhaps a little less lucky. Gaius Helvius Cinna was an accomplished poet and a rising star in politics who happened to share a name with one of Caesar's assassins, and this caused a pro-Caesar crowd to murder him on the Ides of March or the next day. That scene famously is preserved in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And there's also the famous lawyer Gaius Licinius Macer Calvus, who was known for both his very short stature and for his extraordinary eloquence. In fact, his eloquence was so overwhelming that one of his opponents in court actually complained and effectively said that it was an unfair contest and that the jurors, or the judges in this case, would be misled because he simply couldn't compete, and that therefore they should find in his favor because he was just being unfairly bullied by his intellectual superior. So it's a pretty weak move, but it does go to show you just how formidable Macer Calvus must be if one of his fellow Roman aristocrats is pleading weakness in that way in order to try to defeat him, if he thinks that's the only path forward. Both Helvius Cinna, who was murdered, as I mentioned, on the Ides of March, and Macer Calvus died young, as would, of course, Catullus, who never lived to see the Civil War, and our own Quintus Cornificius would also not live as long as he might have otherwise. However, Cornificius did live long enough to write some things that gave him a literary legacy. He worked in the genre called epyllion, which is sort of little epic. And this was something that was very popular in the Hellenistic period. So it was a part of the poetry in the Greek world that was being produced after the time of Alexander. And what these are little epics. So imagine either an epic kind of like Homer, but just much, much shorter, or a kind of mock epic, where it's something that's a little bit ridiculous, and you pretend that it's epic. His work was known as the Glaucus, and it was very well regarded. It was one of the best known examples of a Roman epyllion. And of course, this work is today lost, so we don't know exactly what it was like, but we can kind of guess a little bit. Now, when it comes to the preservation of Cornificius's work and also the work of his sister Cornificia, we know that both of them were still being read and were standard issue as in the early 5th century CE. So Macrobius, who was a bit of a scholar of linguistics, tells us that it was none other than Quintus Cornificius who coined the term bimembris, which means with double member. And most likely the meaning of that is a man with two penises. So apparently the Glaucus had some rather fun material in it. And also we can imagine that Quintus Cornificius would have been a pretty big fan of Brad Neely's George Washington, since of course George Washington famously had 30 penises. As for his sister Cornificia, St. Jerome had read her epigrams and said that they were quite excellent. And Jerome and Macrobius both wrote approximately around 425 or so CE. So this means that as late as the 5th century, when the Western Roman Empire fell, you could still access the works of Cornificius and his sister. There's also an inscription dedicated to Cornificia, which mentions him as a praetor and an augur. When it comes to the details of Quintus Cornificius's early career, we really don't know a whole lot. At some point, he was elected to the College of Augurs, but that could have been later as the Civil War was ongoing. After all, Caesar did tend to appoint his various cronies to different offices, including vacancies among the augurs and pontiffs. So it's possible that Cornificius owed that appointment to a later date, but it's also possible that he was able to pull strings with learned men of an older generation and be elected to that office at a much younger age. It's hard to say. Once Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49, Cornificius, along with most of his friends, and indeed most of the learned young men in Rome, they all decided to go with Caesar. Caesar offered more opportunities for young rising stars, and it's also simply possible that they felt that Caesar was less responsible for the war beginning, given that the Senate proceedings were largely held up and sabotaged by men such as Lentulus Crus, the current consul, Pompey in the background, and of course the notorious Metellus Scipio. Not to mention, of course, Cato the Younger. So there could be a number of reasons why Cornificius went with Caesar. Another is that he might have agreed with Cicero's friend Caelius, who simply said that he's going to side with the winner, and that Caesar is the more experienced general with more seasoned troops under his command, therefore he's the likely winner. We don't really know, but it is worth considering briefly what Cornificius hoped to accomplish. Overall, my impression of him is that he's probably more principled than Caelius, but again, we just don't know enough about Cornificius's politics to say that for sure. And we also know that later on he will fall prey to the division between the various Caesarians. And exactly how that played out we'll have to explore in a minute, but I certainly have some thoughts on that. During the Civil War, most of the senior officials in Rome decided to go with Pompey, whereas many of the younger members of the Senate went with Caesar. And this meant that Caesar had to make a virtue of necessity. He had to bank on the idea that these young, unproven men would have ability to make up for their lack of experience. And so he was forced to entrust many of them with commands that were beyond what they had earned up to that point. The most famous example of this, of course, is where he sends Curio the Younger to control both Sicily and Africa, the two breadbaskets of Rome, with 4 valuable legions. He also will turn to Cornificius under similar circumstances. Cornificius was entrusted with the governance of Illyricum in 48, and he was given pro-Praetorian authority to do this. Illyricum is the northern route from Italy into Greece, and this was one of the potential invasion routes that Caesar considered, but ultimately decided to go by sea. So in many ways, Cornificius, while he would not be directly involved in the operation, was still expected to be ready in case Pompey came northwest at him. And he also, of course, could be asked to march in to reinforce Caesar at any point, or to cover Caesar's retreat if Caesar failed in the south and made his way north to try to save his army. So Cornificius, despite not having an active command on the main front, was still one of the more important pieces on the map for Caesar, and his performance was absolutely crucial to Caesar's overall success. Our two sources for Cornificius's campaign in Illyricum are Caesar's own commentaries about the war, and this part of his commentaries on the Civil War covers the famous battles of Dyrrhachium and Pharsalus. We also have the later Greek historian Appian, who wrote a great deal about the Roman civil wars. If we read between the lines, especially in Caesar, where he always makes sure to point out if an area was loyal to him, he doesn't point out that many areas in Illyricum that were providing aid to his officers. And so we can gather from that that most of the Illyrians were either pro-Pompey, or else they simply wanted to take advantage of division among the Romans to their own ends. And so Cornificius would not receive very much assistance at all from the locals. His 2 legions constituted a pretty formidable fighting force, but again he had to be very cautious because he was still a relatively small army operating in a large and mostly hostile environment. Caesar praises Cornificius's methods. He says that Cornificius was a methodical and careful general who always scouted ahead, avoided any ambushes, and engaged with intelligence when he was fighting fortifications, meaning that he was preserving his force and still taking things as well. So Cornificius was behaving with caution, keeping his force intact, and enhancing Caesar's hold on Illyricum. In other words, doing exactly as he was ordered to do, while not taking any foolish chances or endangering the 2 legions there. He only took a few forts, though, so we shouldn't get too excited about Cornificius's showing. And according to Caesar, he took just enough plunder to keep morale up, so men still felt like they had something to campaign for, and that they were coming away from the campaign better off than they had gone into it. So Cornificius was probably relatively well liked by his men, but we shouldn't necessarily think that he had done enough to really win their loyalty or to inspire them to follow him into hell or anything like that. In retrospect, when we look back at the Battle of Pharsalus, we tend to see it as a decisive moment in Caesar's civil war, a battle which was one-sided enough to effectively end the war in Greece. That being said, this was by no means obvious, even in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Caesar had been outnumbered 2-1 going into the battle, and so for obvious reasons he was not able to pursue or destroy much of Pompey's army. And it would take quite a bit of pursuit to round up many of the members of that army. And because, again, of the numerical disparity, a large portion of those men were able to escape and live to fight another day. Pompey himself was also unaccounted for. Caesar knew that Pompey had survived the battle, but he didn't know his whereabouts. And Caesar's main fear was that Pompey would rally his men somewhere in the north, perhaps Macedonia, or perhaps even Illyricum. And so he issued orders to his various commanders, including Cornificius, to be on the lookout. And at the same time, Cornificius wrote to him and reported that many of the refugees had come to Illyricum under the leadership of the former aedile Marcus Octavius. Octavius had some advantages coming into Illyricum. As I mentioned before, it's pretty apparent that Pompey was more popular in Illyricum than Caesar. Octavius, however, also had personal connections here, as he had recently served as admiral in the area on Pompey's behalf, and he seems to have had some major allies who provided him with ships. So the Illyrians were actually turning out to help him. So Caesar still was mostly worried about Pompey popping up in Macedonia, but now he knew of a place where potentially Pompey might gather troops for such an endeavor. And so Caesar's attention was largely drawn to this area, and he would quickly start shuffling forces around to go help Cornificius deal with Octavius. But in the meantime, Cornificius would show that Caesar had been wise to trust him, as he decided to take some preemptive measures of his own, but without just waiting like a damsel in distress for Caesar to bail him out. We don't know which units Cornificius had under his command, but presumably they were not quite as combat capable as the units who had survived the Battle of Pharsalus. And so Cornificius decided to avoid direct conflict. He also knew that the locals were largely in the tank for Octavius, so fighting a massive field battle would not be in his best interest. Octavius was also gathering a fleet, which would give him the initiative in the area and allow him to strike at will, so Cornificius knew that he needed to try to negate that advantage as much as possible. Cornificius went to one of the few friendly towns in the area called Iadera, and he managed to persuade them to lend him a few ships. These were most likely not really warships, but he could still outfit them with men and go fight boarding actions, and so that's exactly what he did. And since Octavius was not really expecting any kind of attack from that direction, Cornificius was able to take out a few of his ships, and although this was not a huge blow by any means, this still was able to instill a bit of caution in Octavius, who decided to be a little bit more hesitant about going directly after Cornificius, because he figured Cornificius was stronger than he actually was. And perhaps because Octavius was now distracted from that direction, he was sending scouts and outposts in that direction rather than looking at his own rear, where the eventual threat would emerge. And that eventual threat was none other than the Caesarian admiral, Publius Vatinius, who was leading the fleet at Brundisium. And so now we'll look at the commanders who actually did come to the relief of Cornificius and arguably save his bacon, although as we've seen, Cornificius was doing what he needed to do, and perhaps he would have been able to hold out a lot longer if he had had to. One of the more senior men who sided with Caesar in the Civil War was Aulus Gabinius, who had been consul back in 58. Gabinius had a wealth of experience out east during Pompey's campaigns, and because of his ties to both Caesar and Pompey, he refused to take active part in the war up to this point. However, after Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus, Caesar called him into the theater of operations with his 2 new legions and ordered him to save Illyricum and be ready to march at a moment's notice into Macedonia. Caesar was still convinced at that moment that Macedonia is where Pompey would reemerge and try to rally his troops. So Gabinius's task was fairly important, although the 2 legions he led were not of the highest quality due to their inexperience. And in ancient warfare, as in all warfare, experience is very important for determining the quality of a unit. Perhaps more important, if anything, than in almost any other period. Another factor that worked against Gabinius, though, was not just that his men were fresh-faced and had never seen blood before, but also that he apparently did a pretty poor job of dealing with his logistics. And so he did not bring enough supplies to march through Illyricum in the winter, and as a result he tried to assault a few cities to get supplies, and those assaults failed. And so as his men ran out of supplies, they ran into trouble. He was forced to retreat to the city of Salona. He was able to save that from Octavius, but in the process of that campaign, he was either wounded or simply fell ill due to overexertion, and he died. And this is after he'd already lost a couple thousand men. So the 2 legions he had led had proved to be not quite effective, and they were now stranded. So they themselves would require rescuing. Fortunately for the Caesarian cause, Publius Vatinius, the admiral at Brundisium, would be significantly more successful. So perhaps taking advantage of the earlier distraction created by Cornificius, Vatinius sails in with his ships, and he manages to take Octavius from behind and defeat him in a naval battle. And apparently this battle was greatly aided by veteran troops who happened to be on hand. So what Vatinius did is that he took the men who had not been able to go to Greece due to illness, and he used them as marines on his ships. So these were veterans of the Gallic Wars, and when they encountered Octavius, they were far harder and more experienced, and so that carried the day. And once Vatinius had cleared out Octavius, Octavius would then flee to join the army of Metellus Scipio and Cato in Africa, and that would leave Cornificius free to reoccupy all of Illyricum and establish order, which he did shortly after Vatinius departed. A couple years later, Cornificius was sent once again as a pro-Praetorian governor to the rugged province of Cilicia in what is now southeast Turkey. Cilicia was notorious for both coastal pirates and inland bandits, so just like any other governor of this province, Cornificius had his work cut out for him. Famously, a few years earlier, Cicero had governed here, and he had hated every minute of it. Cornificius however, was made of sterner stuff, and so he most likely enjoyed it, or at least enjoyed the opportunities that a place like Cilicia could present. However, in the event, most of the problems that he would face as governor were not within his own borders, but rather to his southeast in Syria. Here, two of the legions that had served under Pompey at Pharsalus had been reassigned, and one of the senior commanders here was a dedicated Pompeian of the equestrian order named Quintus Caecilius Bassus, and rather than honoring his oath to Caesar to defend Syria, he instead rallied two legions to the Pompeian or senatorial cause at the city of Apamea, and then created a new front for the Caesarians to worry about. Even more troublesome, not only did he revolt from Caesar and lead his men along with him, but he also invited the Parthians to intervene on behalf of the senatorial cause. So this created a new front that otherwise should have been closed by Caesar's actions both at Pharsalus and in its aftermath. The initial response fell to Cornificius as the nearest governor with an army, but before he could really do much, he was recalled, and his successor took up the command of the Cilician army in Syria, only to be forced out once the Parthians arrived. This situation was only retrieved in late 44 after the death of Caesar by Gaius Cassius Longinus. So this means also that yes, when Caesar was planning to go east in order to fight the Parthians, this would have actually been his first order of business, is dealing with Bassus and those two renegade legions at Apamea. But because of Cassius's political allegiance, these men surrendered peacefully to him, and these two legions most likely engaged at the Battle of Philippi, with the kind of unofficial consensus being that Bassus most likely was killed in action at Philippi, fighting against the Roman commanders he hated so much, Octavian and Antony. Quintus Cornificius achieved his highest office in the year 45 when he served as praetor. We don't know exactly what kind of praetor he was, whether he was the urban praetor or whether he held some other function, but nonetheless he had held the second highest magistracy, and this meant that, as a loyal Caesarian, he was in line to be consul one day. I don't believe he was in the pre-ordered line of succession for the consulship yet, but his time would come soon enough. So most likely he was quite distressed when Caesar was assassinated at the theater of Pompey, because this was very much a blow to his career prospects. So we don't know exactly whether he was present or not, but it seems like most of Caesar's supporters were absent at the time, so most likely he did not live to see his patron get murdered. Appian now tells us in his book The Civil Wars that Cornificius was a partisan of the Senate. And the only way that this would make sense is if we assume that Cornificius decided to throw in his lot more with the assassins than he did with the inexperienced Octavian or the somewhat unstable and unreliable Mark Antony. So at this point, Cornificius's sympathies shifted a bit, and this would play a pivotal role in the rest of his career, as this choice of allegiance would prove to be fatal for the poet praetor. Historically, Mark Antony and the conspirators got along rather cordially for several months before they began to plot against one another. And it would be quite a while before Antony would cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war on his political rivals. One of the parts of the settlement that they reached initially, when it seemed like they would be able to cooperate, is that governorships were allotted in order to get certain unpopular men out of Rome so that the crowd wouldn't murder them. And among the appointments made was the appointment of Cornificius to Africa Vetus. There's a good chance that this was an appointment that was supposed to happen prior to Caesar's death and it was simply fulfilled, or else Cornificius was slotted in because he was someone who was acceptable to both the Caesarians and the conspirators. It's hard to say, but Africa Vetus, or Old Africa, is effectively what had once been Carthaginian Africa. This was one of the breadbaskets of the Roman world, and so it was important to make sure it was in the hands of a capable governor. You also had the occasional threat of nomadic raiding, so it was safer than his previous post, but still not a cakewalk necessarily. And Cornificius, by this point, seems to have fallen out with Antony at least a little bit, and Antony was rapidly losing friends and admirers as he began to try to take away power from various rivals, including, of course, young Octavian, who ended up inheriting Caesar's name and the loyalty of many of his men. And so one of Antony's legalistic moves was to get a number of appointments revoked, including Cornificius's governorship in Africa. However, knowing that Antony was losing his grip on Rome, Cornificius knew that it was only a matter of time before Antony would be in political trouble. And so when his would-be successor arrived, Gaius Calvisius Sabinius, Cornificius simply told him to kick rocks and waited out his time. And eventually, his suspicions were confirmed on December 20th, when Antony's laws were all annulled. Antony then marched north and would be besieged at Mutina. And so Antony would look like he was defeated at this point, and it looked like Cornificius had been right to defy Antony and the law of Rome. But of course, the worm could turn rather rapidly during the Roman civil wars, and unfortunately Cornificius found that out the hard way. For a time, it looked like Antony would prevail over Decimus Brutus at Mutina. However, then Octavian would decide to throw in his lot with Cicero in the Senate, and so he would join the consuls as they marched to relieve Decimus Brutus. Antony was defeated, and it looked like Antony's career was now over. However, in November, after what must have been the worst year of Antony's life to that point, the year 43, Antony was able to make common cause with Octavian, who had figured out by this point, if he didn't already know it, that the Senate was using him to their own ends, and of course the general of Gaul Lepidus, and they formed together the Second Triumvirate. And now power suddenly and dramatically shifted back to Mark Antony and his new allies. One of the first things the three men did to cement their pact was to each write a list of men they wanted proscribed or legally condemned and executed in order to secure their power. And unlike the first triumvirate, they also would actually take an open title of triumvir. So they were to rule as a committee of three. And one of the names that was placed on this list, no doubt by Antony himself, was Cornificius's name. So Cornificius was now officially a public enemy, and a new governor with an army was coming to replace him by force. So this was going to get nasty, and Cornificius was in for what would amount to the fight of his life. The triumvirs turned to a rising star named Titus Sextius and asked him to expel and execute the troublesome Quintus Cornificius. This would enable the triumvirs to reclaim control of Africa Vetus, which of course supplied a lot of grain to Rome. One of Cornificius's legions, however, was not entirely loyal. One of them had actually served under Octavian at the Battle of Mutina less than a year earlier. And so most likely, Octavian's units were all raised from Caesarian veterans, and so these men would owe much more allegiance to the established stars of the Caesarian cause, men like Octavian, who was now Gaius Julius Caesar the Younger, or Mark Antony. Certainly not to the poet Quintus Cornificius. Now, presumably a couple of these officers might have been fans of his Glaucus, but not enough. And so most of these men were not willing to fight particularly hard on his behalf if they were willing to fight at all. In fact, Cornificius would famously complain, according to a later source, that his men were little more than hares and helmets, that they were effectively useless. And he would now be defeated and captured and then executed legally at Utica, which is the same site where Cato the Younger took his own life back in 46. So yet another Roman of Praetorian rank and some fame would meet his end at this city, which at this time would have been the major city in North Africa, since Carthage had been destroyed and not quite yet rebuilt. This might not seem like a very impressive victory, since most likely Cornificius only had about 2 legions, and by all accounts he's a fairly average general. But Titus Sextius' descendants were quite impressed with his achievement, and in fact they would inflate its importance by later adopting the cognomen Africanus as a celebration of this victory over the Praetorian poet Quintus Cornificius. This is also, to the best of my knowledge, the only time when a descendant of someone has decided that the feat of their ancestor was actually far more extraordinary than anyone at the time recognized, and then chose to award themselves a cognomen based on this old achievement that was not nearly as impressive at the time. So kudos to the descendants of Titus Sextius for really taking advantage of what was a rather humdrum victory in a minor operation during a civil war. Sometimes when I try to explain the significance of a minor Roman official, it can be a little bit of a challenge, but in this case it's really not. While his work hasn't survived to the present, Quintus Cornificius was clearly a major player in his own time. He also was a pretty effective politician, even though, of course, that's not really what he was known for in the end. But if we look at the governorships he held, he was usually entrusted with difficult areas, and he comported himself well. He had a level head, he made sound decisions, and while he does not seem to possess any kind of military genius, he certainly was a competent commander who was able to avoid disaster, despite sometimes being faced with unfavorable circumstances. His politics also helped to demonstrate that this was a very complex era, that the party lines that we sometimes ascribe to this period don't really work when we think about it on the level of different individuals. And he also shows us that there were plenty of people who were multi-talented at the time, because he was both an ambitious politician and this very successful poet. That being said, of the two things, the poetry was what really made his name stick. And so his works, as we mentioned, were still being read as late as the early 5th century by Jerome, the famous Christian saint, and also by the scholar Macrobius. And Cornificius was lucky that he had his sister Cornificia, or I guess we could say that by the same token, she was lucky to have him, since their fame seems to have been mutually reinforcing. That is to say that any time one of them was mentioned, the other would be brought up. So there's a famous inscription honoring Cornificia in Rome, and it mentions that her brother Quintus was also a poet, that he was a praetor, and that he was also an augur. So the two of them made sure that the other remained relevant and a cultural icon. And since they both worked in different fields of poetry, this meant that most likely the teachers of Latin poetry would tell their students, okay, now we're going to read this man's sister's work, or now that we've read Cornificia's epigrams, we're going to read the works by her brother, who coincidentally was a praetor in the late Republic. And since a lot of Roman aristocrats really started to revere the Republic after it was gone, and really started to lionize the figures who had actually been free to make political decisions, that gave Cornificius a bit more of an aura than he ever had in his own lifetime. So he was someone who most later generations of Romans would have regarded, and regarded rather highly, even though he, of course, resides in obscurity today. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and remember to be thankful for the fact that I did not use all Jim Cornette images and refer to Cornificius as corny the entire time.